Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the Terror Cellar, where we dive deep into the true stories of the unexplained, the eerie and the downright strange. Today I want to share in a story sent in from listener Peter Bradburn, a story that stayed with him for years and continues to puzzle him to this day. It's about a man named Jack, and it all happened in the small terraced house he grew up in. A typical neighbourhood where everyone knew everyone, and you could count on your neighbours for a chat over the garden fence. So if you're ready, sit back, relax, and get ready for Old Man Jack. I was about 8 years old and had a very simple and happy childhood. Next door to us lived Jack, an elderly man who had spent his entire life in the same house. He inherited it from his mother, and before that it belonged to his grandmother. Jack was a quiet but friendly man, the kind who always made time to wave and say hello. His pride and joy, though, was his garden. He took great care of it, and for some reason he seemed to take a liking to our garden as well. Jack insisted on mowing our lawn regularly, never asking for anything in return. He wasn't doing it for the money. I think he just liked to keep himself busy, to feel useful. I remember my mum feeling a bit sorry for Jack. He lived alone and we didn't know much about his family or if he had any close connections. We gave him a key to our garden gate so he could come and go as he pleased. And every time he finished mowing, my mum would give him a cake and a cup of tea as a little thank you. He never accepted any payment, but he always appreciated the gesture. We would always find his empty teacup sat there with a few crumbs on a plate. Now this is where the story takes a turn into the strange and unexplainable. One summer day, I was playing in my bedroom and I saw Jack in his garden. He was standing there, looking up at my window and waving at me. I waved back, of course. It was such a normal, everyday occurrence that I didn't even think twice about it. Over the next few days, I saw Jack more and more. Sometimes in his garden, sometimes even in ours, tending to the plants or pulling weeds. He'd always wave and I'd always wave back. One afternoon I told my mum that Jack was in our garden again. She thought it'd be a nice idea to make him a cup of tea as usual. She opened the back door and called out, "Hello, Jack." He was at the far end of the garden where the weeds had got a bit unruly. She set the tea out for him in his usual place, but this time he just kept working, or so we thought. We shrugged it off, maybe he was too busy, we figured. But this same thing happened again the next day. Jack was in the garden, waving, but never coming up to the house. My mum kept making him tea, but he never drank it. The cups just sat there, going cold. We didn't think much of it at the time. After all, it was Jack. He was a bit of a character, and we were used to his ways. Then one day, I looked out of my bedroom window and saw two strangers walking around Jack's garden. A man and a woman, looking at things in a way that made me curious. I told my mum and she went outside to see who they were. It turns out they were Jack's son and daughter, people we had never met or even knew existed. Naturally, my mum asked them what they were doing, and that's when they dropped the bombshell. They were preparing to sell the house because Jack had passed away. He had died weeks ago, in his armchair, and no one had known. They had only discovered him when they couldn't reach him by phone and became worried. The coroner estimated that Jack had been dead for about 2 weeks. My mum and I were in complete shock. We couldn't believe what we were hearing. How could Jack be dead? We'd seen him in our garden earlier that day waving, just like always. My mum was speechless and blurted out, "But he was just here, in our garden." But Jack's children insisted he had passed away 2 weeks prior, and there was no way he could have been in our garden. That's when it hit us. The cold tea, the fact that he never came up to the door anymore. Jack had been gone, but somehow we were still seeing him, still waving to him, as if nothing had changed. We had been watching his spirit. It's hard to explain the feelings we had in those moments. Fear, confusion, maybe a bit of both. But there was also something comforting about it. Jack hadn't vanished completely. He was still there, in the garden he loved, doing the things he enjoyed. And he seemed happy, always waving, always busy. It wasn't scary, at least not in the way you might imagine. Sure, it was strange, surreal even, but it never felt threatening. In the days that followed, we continued to catch glimpses of Jack. Sometimes I'd see him at his window, waving like always, or tending to his plants. And sometimes my mum would too. But the oddest part was that no one else ever saw him. Just us. It was like Jack's spirit had chosen to stick around and keep us company. Perhaps because he felt a sense of responsibility for our garden, or maybe because he had found peace in his familiar surroundings. It became normal for us, this strange coexistence with a ghost. My mum and I would talk about it, sometimes scaring ourselves a little when we thought too much about it. But mostly, we found comfort in the idea that Jack was still there, still doing what he loved, and as long as he was happy, we didn't mind him sticking around. So that's the story of Old Man Jack, a kind neighbour who couldn't leave his garden behind, even in death. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, it's a reminder that sometimes the ones we lose never truly leave us, right? They linger in the places they loved, in the small, everyday moments that made them who they were. And now we have story number 2, sent in by Abby Reddin, and this is called Faceless in the Forest. For many years I've enjoyed walking. I like to put my headphones on and just walk and walk. It has always cleared my mind and made me able to organise things. I tend to walk the same way most days, which involve going past a large wooded forest. I normally like to keep my head down and get my daily steps in, so I never really pay much attention to what's around me. One particular day, I decided to stray off my usual course and head into the forest. The trees were very tall, and all you could see were hundreds of thin tree trunks staring at you as you look around. I heard that there was a lake you can get to if you cut through the forest, so I headed in and made my way deeper into the trees. The sound of wind, crunching and acorns bouncing off my feet seemed to be the soundtrack. For some reason, I didn't want my music on as I walked through the forest. I felt I needed to hear what was going on around me, as for some reason I felt a little intimidated by the huge trees and the dense landscape. As I walked, I checked my phone but had no signal. My battery was full though, so it wasn't going to run out just yet. So I kept walking forwards and forwards. Everything felt so overwhelming that at one point I couldn't tell which way I was actually facing. I started to have a little panic and tried to get myself together. I thought the best thing to do is just walk in one direction and eventually I'd come to something. Whilst walking, I had an eerie feeling that something was watching me. I kept looking around in every direction with a paranoid look on my face, but everything just looked the same. I also kept hearing the crunching of branches behind me, as if I was being closely followed by something very heavy. After walking for what felt like hours, I stopped to have some of my drink. The wind was picking up, and the light was slowly starting to fade, so I was aware I had to leave. ASAP. I turned around and looked behind me and caught a glimpse of what looked like to be a large man with long hair just standing there in the distance, staring at me. He was quite far away, but it was enough to alarm me. I decided to forget about the lake and just try and make my way home. I curiously looked around again to look, but he had gone. As I turned to carry on walking forward, I saw him ahead, in front of me. How the hell did he get there so fast? And why? At this point, I started to freak out and grab my phone, but it was dead. I also forgot I had no signal in the forest anyway. Everything started to feel very strange and the trees felt like they were closing in on me. I looked up to see the man even closer this time and half hidden behind a tree. The thing that sent shivers through me was that the man didn't seem to have a face. It was just a dark blur and I couldn't make out any facial features. This time I started running as fast as I possibly could through the uneven terrain. The thought of him getting any closer scared the hell out of me. I looked around again, but he had vanished. Eventually I made it out to a public footpath which surrounded the forest and kept running. When I got home, I couldn't get my head around what had just happened and the dark blurry face terrified me. I tried to explain to a friend, but it didn't sound half as bad as the experience was and probably sounded ridiculous. Every time I go for a walk now, I completely avoid the forest and have no intention of going anywhere near it again. Thank you, Abby, for sending in that cool little story there. For me, I think in this situation, being alone in a forest on a windy day is pretty weird anyway, isn't it? A bit scary because, yeah, the trees, the tall, thin trees are very intimidating and they can make you feel very small and lost. You know what I mean? So, yeah, that's pretty creepy alone. But the thought of seeing this dark figure, this man with long hair at a really far distance and then a really close distance within seconds is the thing that's the problem here, right? Obviously there is no possible way he could have got, when you look behind you, he was right back there. There's no possible way he could have just got in front of you like that. Do you know what I mean? Even if he had sprinted, you would have seen him. Or, so what, it's obviously some kind of strange paranormal incident, right? You can sort of think about it and think, oh, maybe it was just some weirdo stood in the forest, some pervert or something just standing there. But the fact that he got in front of you so quick and closer again, and you couldn't make out his facial features, just makes it a little bit paranormal, doesn't it? So, yeah, I wouldn't go back in that forest again, love. Don't bother. Thank you so much for listening in today. That was a cool little story, that was. And it felt a little different to the usual settings, which always tend to be in a house. They always tend to be in the same kind of situation. So having one outside is cool. It's something different. But I will see you all next week for another chilling episode. So please tell your friends, spread the word, and we'll see you there. Don't have nightmares. Bye-bye.